Hey everybody, this is the first chapter of part 2 of Gustav A. Vetter's Dialectical Materialism, a historical and systematic survey. Chapter 1 is titled Conception of Philosophy. Part 2 of this book, did I say that already? Maybe I didn't, I'm not sure. The system of Soviet philosophy. So here we go. Chapter 1, Conception of Philosophy. Section 1, Philosophy and the Special Sciences. It is to the credit of official Soviet philosophy that despite a variety of attempts, even within Bolshevism itself, to deny philosophy any title to continued existence, it has preserved the concept of philosophy as an independent intellectual discipline. This is the outcome of its struggle against the mechanists, the quote, positivists of Soviet philosophy. Again, in specifying the object of philosophy in relation to the natural sciences, it was in the course of its struggle against mechanism and, quote, Menshevizing idealism, and, quote, that the official Soviet philosophy worked out its adopted position. Whereas the mechanists wanted to get rid of all philosophy and to see the entire Marxist, quote, world outlook embodied in the latest findings of the positive sciences, the Menshevizing idealists were accused of having degraded Marxist philosophy to a mere methodology and robbed it of any positive, quote, content, philosophy having become in their hands a system of empty concepts and abstract categories, divorced from the concrete historical development of the natural and social sciences. How far this objection may be legitimately argued against de Burin has already been discussed in Part 1. In the view of the official Soviet philosophy, dialectical materialism is neither exclusively a methodology nor yet a general theory of the world built up on the basis of the natural sciences, but both of these a combination of world outlook and methodology. In the first place, it is certainly a world outlook, a theory of reality, and as such deals in the material sense with the same subject matter as the special sciences. But if this is so, the question arises, how then is philosophy possible as a true scientific discipline alongside the special sciences? B.M. Kedrov dealt with this question in considerable detail in his address to the Zurich Congress of the International Union of the Philosophy of Science in August 1954. In antiquity, so he began, philosophy was the sole science, and as such also included material appropriate to the natural and social sciences. The relation between philosophy and all their branches of knowledge consisted in an absolute subordination of the one to the other. The viewpoint has also survived in those later systems of natural philosophy, some of them very recent, which have attempted to incorporate into philosophy all branches of human knowledge. Here philosophy figures as a, quote, science of sciences, end quote, or the, quote, queen of the sciences, end quote. The individual is swallowed up in the general. Since the Renaissance, however, one field of knowledge after another has separated itself from philosophy as an independent science, and hence there arose in the 19th century the positivistic attitude towards philosophy, which refused to allow philosophy any title to existence at all, since once the individual sciences had detached themselves, it was no longer left with any subject matter of its own. Here the relation between philosophy and the special sciences consists in a complete antagonism. The individual has swallowed up the general. It was Marx and Engels, according to Kedrov, who first found the true solution. The process of differentiation among the sciences did not remove the foundations of philosophy, but led to a more exact determination of its proper subject matter. Whereas the special sciences confine their inquiries to a particular portion of reality and investigate the laws operative in that field, philosophy's inquiries are directed to the laws operative in reality as a whole and in all fields in common. Hence, the mutual relations of philosophy and the special sciences no longer consist in subordination of one to the other or in antagonism, but in a mutual interfusion and supplementation. Philosophy provides the general method of scientific knowledge and a philosophical interpretation of the detailed information furnished by the sciences. The sciences supply the concrete factual material which serves philosophy as a starting point in its task of generalization. Quote, the foundation for this view of the mutual relation between philosophy and the other sciences consists in the true dialectical solution of the problem of the mutual relation between general and particular. In scientific knowledge, these two opposites form a unity, interfuse with one another, without either destroying or dividing themselves from one another. End quote. B.M. Kedrov, on the classification of sciences. Thus, the subject matter of dialectical materialism consists, according to Soviet philosophy, in, quote, the most general laws of motion, change and development in nature, society and knowledge, investigation of which gives rise to a unitary scientific world picture, end quote. G.F. Alexandrov, excuse me. It is precisely because dialectical materialism investigates the most general laws applicable to reality as a whole that it is able to provide a, quote, closed, all-comprehensive world picture, end quote. M.A. Leonov, in the book The Classics of Marxist-Leninism on the Content of Dialectical Materialism. It becomes a, quote, total world outlook which generalizes the findings of all the sciences, end quote. V. Svetlov T. Oyserman, in the book The Rise of Marxism, a Revolutionary Upheaval in Philosophy, 1948, end footnote. In this conception of philosophy, the Soviet philosophers make a definite break with the anti-philosophical attitude which is here and there to be encountered in Engels. For despite Kedrov's attempts to cite the latter as a crown witness to the correctness of this intermediate position in regard to the scope of philosophy, there is no mistaking a markedly positivistic element in Engels' point of view. Quote, as soon as each separate science is required, end quote, Engels writes in Anti-Düring, quote, to get clarity as to its position in the general great totality of things and of our knowledge of things, a special science dealing with this totality is superfluous, while still independently survives of all former philosophy, is the science of thought and its laws, formal logic and dialectics. Everything else is merged in the positive science of nature and history, end quote. Engels, Anti-Düring. Similarly, in another passage, quote, it is in fact no longer a philosophy, but a simple world outlook which has to establish its validity and be applied not in a science of sciences standing apart, but within the positive sciences, end quote. Anti-Düring. It may be admitted indeed that Engels' attitude on this point is not unambiguous. In certain passages, Engels interprets the quote dialectics, which apart from logic, Engels is alone ready to leave standing of all previous philosophy as, quote, the science of the general laws of motion and development of nature, human society, and thought, end quote. Engels. And hence is a discipline which includes not only the supreme laws of thought, but also the most general laws of being, a sort of, quote, ontology. But at other times, Engels confines, quote, dialectics to the residue of philosophy, ejected from nature and history and confined to the field of thought, quote, for philosophy, which has been expelled from nature and history, there remains only the realm of pure thought, so far as it is left, the theory of the laws of the thought process itself, logic and dialectics, end quote. Engels, Ludwig Feuerbach. Thus, whereas Engels in many passages of his writings at least attempts to limit philosophy purely to the field of thought, the official Soviet philosophy reappears as a science of the most general laws of being as well, precisely because dialectical materialism as a doctrine of the most general laws of motion and development within the world aspires to the making of assertions about reality. It also lays claim to considerations at the same time as a universal methodology, without which no single science could subsist. Zhdanov advanced this claim in the discussion on Alexandrov's book, History of Western European Philosophy. Quote, Marxist philosophy is distinguished from preceding philosophical systems, is not a science above other sciences, Rather, it is an instrument of scientific investigation, a method penetrating all natural and social sciences, enriching itself with their attainments in the course of their development. End quote. Inasmuch as Soviet philosophy claims to equip all branches of science with a single unitary method, quote, the method of dialectical and historical materialism, end quote, it would appear, in spite of Zhdanov's assurances to the contrary, to figure once more in relation to the special sciences as a science of sciences standing above them and considerably restricting these sciences in their freedom of maneuver. Quote, the Marxist method provides all the sciences with general principles of operation, shows them how they should approach the phenomena, and in what manner they are to investigate them. End quote. How this leadership of the special sciences by dialectical materialism, the Marxist method, functions in practice, we've already discovered in part 1 from a concrete example in the field of biology. Wait, did I press record? Sorry about that. Anyway, at a later stage in the chapter on dialectical materialism in modern science, we shall see how even after Stalin's death it still comes about that dialectical materialism not only shows the way to the sciences as a method, but also commits them a priori to specific positions as an assertion about reality. In virtue of the above explained relation between dialectical materialism and special sciences, the philosophers are obliged to familiarize themselves so far as possible with the findings of these sciences, and there is a correspondingly rigorous insistence that the scientists also should not be content to specialize in their own particular fields, but should equally be well acquainted with Marxist philosophy. This demand is justified on the ground that, quote, individual laws are simply manifestations of the general laws, apart from the fact that the general law manifests itself in various fields in a variety of ways. All these different manifestations themselves contain an element of generality. Hence, a profound grasp of the individual law presupposes acquaintance with the general law on which the individual law is based, end quote. The Pro-C philosophy cites as a shining example the Sverdlovsk branch of the Academy of Sciences, which organized philosophical seminars for high school teachers in the various departments of science. One on philosophical problems in chemistry, for example, others for physicists, geologists, and biologists, and even one for mathematicians. It is noteworthy that in recent years, since the death of Stalin, voices have again been raised in criticism of the above definition of the concept of dialectical materialism and its relation to the individual sciences. In the discussion on the new textbook of dialectical materialism, issued under Alexandrov's editorship, V. Karpushin and M. Dymchevsky of the University of Moscow attacked the idea that it was the business of dialectical materialism to provide a, quote, unitary scientific world picture, end quote. The difference between Marxist philosophy and the other sciences lies not in the fact that the former investigates the world as a whole instead of mere individual ranges of phenomena, but, quote, above all in the fact that it represents a tool of scientific inquiry, a method permeating all the natural and social sciences, end quote. New section, individual philosophical disciplines. As we have seen evidence, we have just seen evidence of Engels' propensity to limit the scope of philosophy so far as possible in favor of the special sciences. Of all the manifold specialized disciplines in philosophy which generally form the subject of philosophical inquiry, epistemology, general theory of being or ontology, cosmology, psychology, anthropology, ethics, aesthetics, the philosophies of history and law, and natural theology or theodicy, Engels was only prepared to leave room for epistemology. Engels' first step was to exclude nature and history from the sphere of philosophy. So far as the philosophy of nature was concerned, this was only possible in Engels' view so long as the natural sciences were not yet in a position to provide a comprehensive picture of the interconnections in nature, an a posteriori account of the ties linking both individual phenomena in the various fields of inquiry and also the various inquiries one with another. The philosophy of nature attempted what science was not yet able to provide. Quote, by putting in place of the real but as yet unknown interconnections, ideal fancied interconnections, filling the missing facts by figments of the mind and bridging the actual gaps merely in imagination, end quote. Engels, Ludwig Feuerbach. Thanks to the three great discoveries already referred to, which have disclosed the totality of events in nature as a single interconnected, dialectically advancing process of development, quote, we have now arrived at the point where we can demonstrate the interconnections between the processes in nature, not only in particular spheres, but also the interconnection of these particular spheres on the whole, and so can present in an approximately systematic form a comprehensive view of the interconnections in nature by means of the facts provided by empirical natural science itself, end quote. To this day, excuse me, I fucked up. 1 second. Excuse me. This, however, signifies the end of the philosophy of nature. Quote, today, when one needs to comprehend the results of natural scientific investigation only dialectically, that is in the sense of their own interconnection, in order to arrive at a, quote, system of nature, and, quote, sufficient for our time, ... Today, natural philosophy is finally disposed of. Every attempt at resurrecting natural philosophy would be not only superfluous, but a step backwards, end quote. Engels. Engels also cut out the philosophy of history in a similar fashion, quote, but what is true of nature, which is hereby recognized also as a historical process of development, is likewise true of the history of society in all its branches, human and divine. Here too the philosophy of history, of right, of religion, etc., has consisted in the substitution of an interconnection fabricated in the mind of the philosopher for the real interconnection to be demonstrated in the events, end quote. Engels. This having appeared to consist in the realization of some idea, or in a, quote, mysterious providence, end quote. Quote, here, therefore, just as in the realm of nature, it was necessary to do away with these fabricated artificial interconnections by the discovery of the real interconnections, a task which ultimately amounts to the discovery of the general laws of motion, which assert themselves as the ruling laws of motion in the history of human society, end quote. Engels, Ludwig Feuerbach. This task has now been completed, in Engels' opinion, by the working out of the Marxist materialist conception of history, which makes any sort of philosophy of history superfluous from now on. The outcome of all these reflections was that all that was left for Engels of the whole of philosophy was logic and the theory of knowledge. In Soviet philosophy, however, we find in the course of time an ever more obvious retreat from this position of Engels and a gradual reinstatement of the individual philosophic disciplines in their rightful places. Whereas Engels, having driven philosophy out of nature and history, had sought to restrict philosophy to the realm of pure thought, quote, logic and dialectics, end quote, Soviet philosophy interprets the dialectic in the sense elsewhere conceded to dialectic by Engels, namely as a, quote, science of the general laws of motion and development of nature, human society, and thought, end quote. The result has been that in this way, nature and history have again been smuggled back into the jurisdiction of philosophy, from which Engels wished to exclude them. In addition to epistemology, a general theory of being, i.e. ontology, has again appeared as part of the content of dialectical materialism, although the term, quote, ontology is avoided in Soviet philosophy. As we shall see in due course, the basic laws of the materialist dialectic, law of the unity and struggle of opposites, etc., together with the categories of dialectical materialism, have a meaning that is not only or even primarily epistemological, but is ontological instead. Apart from this, moreover, the last few years of philosophical developments in the Soviet Union have shown an evident tendency towards the gradual incorporation of an increasing number of individual disciplines into the system of Soviet philosophy. The Philosophical Institute of the Soviet Academy of Sciences includes sections devoted to the following subjects: dialectical materialism, historical materialism, history of philosophy, and philosophy of science, to which 3 further sections were added in 1956 for psychology, aesthetics, and atheism, respectively. What is particularly astonishing about this revival of the individual philosophic disciplines is the reintroduction of the philosophy of science after Engels had so emphatically dismissed the philosophy of science. In order to make the resultant contradiction of Engels less obvious, the title, quote, philosophy of science, end quote, has, however, been rather shamefacedly adopted instead of simply calling it, quote, philosophy of nature. Lenin himself had already felt that the rise of modern science, so far from rendering the philosophy of nature superfluous, had created, on the contrary, a pressing necessity for such a field. Later Soviet philosophy has followed his example, especially in the controversy over Maturin's biology. But the implied departure from the traditions of Marxist philosophy was very properly recognized by Professor Mezlenikov of the Bashkir Pedagogical Institute already in 1949 at an all-union conference of philosophy professors, was moved to protest against the introduction of this, quote, so-called philosophy of science, end quote. Firstly, it was in principle impossible to give a satisfactory definition of this specialism. And secondly, it meant a reversion to the past, a transformation of philosophy into a, quote, science of sciences, end quote. From the standpoint of traditional dialectical materialism, he was indeed absolutely right, but his words produced not the slightest echo of response. Hardly less astonishing, even, is the return to psychology. For Marxist philosophy hitherto, concerned as it was solely with nature, society and man as a social being, had been characterized by notable lack of interest in man as an individual. And here it was not just a question of a merely experimental psychology based on scientific methods, but of a philosophical discipline founded on the dialectical materialist thesis that the mental is something essentially distinct from the physical and the physiological. We shall see in more detail later what difficulties the Soviet philosophers have had to contend with, lest they should be compelled also to postulate a spiritual substance essentially distinct from matter as a substratum for mental activity so understood. New section, Section 3, the unity of theory and practice. There are 2 methodological principles in particular which to a large extent give Soviet philosophy a special stamp of its own in Marxist philosophy: the insistence on preserving the unity of theory and practice, and the insistence on party spirit, the partisan character of philosophy. In the polemic not only against revisionism, but also most violently against a variety of deviations within Soviet philosophy itself, it is these 2 methodological principles that have come to ever be more strongly emphasized as the distinguishing characteristics of genuine Marxist-Leninism. The demand for a unity of theory and practice goes back in origin to Marx himself. The whole of his early philosophical development is indeed dominated by the idea that philosophy must be, quote, transcended by being, quote, actualized. The seemingly complete reconciliation of idea and reality in the self-enclosed theory of the Hegelian system has proved a sham to his disciples. It stands in harsh contrast to the contradictory reality of everyday public life in state and society. Under present conditions here, it would be truer to say that man has reached his extreme point of, quote, self-alienation. In the social field, this is represented by the formation of the proletariat. In politics, by the fact that in the, quote, political state, the sphere of public communal affairs, embodied in the constitution and the bureaucracy, stands as something special on its own, in opposition to the private concerns of the individual and of bourgeois society. In the field of spiritual life, man's state of, quote, self-alienation shows itself in his creation of an illusory consciousness of the world in the shape of religion. Marx sees the way out of this situation in a theory advanced by Count von Kiszkowski, namely that the age of thought is to be followed by an age of will, a transformation of reality by way of action. Quote, "It is a psychological law that once the theoretical spirit has been liberated, it turns to practical energy, emerging as will from the Amethys's kingdom of shades, and rounding upon the independently existing world of reality." End quote. Marx, from the doctoral dissertation. But philosophy thereupon ceases to exist. Its actualization is at the same time its defeat, and its transcendence correspondingly implies its actualization. But what does Marx mean by the, quote, actualization of philosophy? Actualization of philosophy means for Marx the transference of the capital I idea out of the realm of pure thought into that of practice. The cleavage between capital I idea and reality must not merely be overcome, as with Hegel. In philosophical cognition, it must also be transcended in concrete perceptible practice. But this real conquest of man's self-alienation and the inauguration of, quote, true reality can only be the work of the historical process itself. The transcending of man's real self-alienation is possible only by way of his practical self-realization. Theoretical cognition thus takes on the role of, quote, criticism. Starting from the idea of a true determination of man, it shows up the existing state of affairs as defective. But at the same time, it must also discover in reality itself the factors responsible for man's self-alienation, and so is likewise able to point out the conditions for transcending them and enabling man to, quote, realize himself. By discovering this contradiction, theoretical cognition itself, a factor in the contradictoriness of reality, becomes a factor making for progress. In spite of this, however, the establishment of a, quote, rational reality must, as already said, be the work of the historical process itself, which therefore always bears within itself already the seeds of rationality. Quote, "Reason has always succeeded, but not always in rational form. The critic can therefore start from any form of theoretical or practical consciousness and develop out of its own form of existing reality, the true reality as its ideal and ultimate goal." End quote. Letter to Ruga, September 1843. According to this notion of Marx's, therefore, the business of criticism is not to, quote, bring truth into reality, but as it were to stand by reality itself in the role of a midwife to deliver it of the truth, that simply by, quote, making the world aware of the world's own consciousness, awakening the world from the world's dreams about the world's self, explaining the world's own actions to the world, ... It will then appear that the world has long been dreaming of something which the world only needs to become aware of in order to possess it in reality. End quote. Marx. What is required, therefore, is not merely that, quote, thought presses towards realization. Reality itself must press towards the thought, end quote. In this case, it is sufficient that theory should sing to the world its, quote, own melody, end quote, in order itself to become a, quote, material force, end quote, by, quote, taking hold of the masses, end quote. Whereas Lenin was later to require a special organization in order to, quote, bring a revolutionary consciousness to the proletarian masses, it is enough for Marx merely that somehow the spark should leap across from thought pressing towards reality into reality pressing towards thought in order to kindle the fires of revolution. Quote, just as philosophy finds in the proletariat philosophy's material weapons, so the proletariat finds in philosophy's intellectual weapons. And as soon as the light of thought has penetrated into the flaccid popular soil, the elevation of Germans into men will be accomplished, end quote. Marx. There is a further factor of importance in Marx's early thought on this topic of the unity of theory and practice, We have seen above that the reason why man, in Marx's view, creates a, quote, inverted picture of the world, unquote, in religion is because present-day society itself by nature represents a, quote, inverted world. But once the, quote, weapon of criticism has been replaced by the, quote, criticism of weapons, the effect of this social and political emancipation of human society will also be to amend its state of mind. Only under communism, therefore, is it possible to apprehend reality in reality's true colors. Now, the Marxian standpoint here outlined also forms the initial starting point for the Soviet theory of the unity of theory and practice. Even though practice is far from attaining the philosophical level... Oh, excuse me, I guess that's... So I'm going to repeat that. I fucked that sentence up. Now, the Marxian standpoint here outlined also forms the initial starting point for the Soviet theory of the unity of theory and practice, even though the latter is far from attaining the philosophical level of Marxist speculations. For a classical formulation of the Soviet view of this doctrine, it is still possible even now to refer to a passage from Stalin's lectures on the foundations of Leninism, delivered at the Sverdlov University in 1924. Quote, "Theory is the experience of the working class movement in all countries, taken in its general aspect. Of course, theory becomes purposeless if theory is not connected with revolutionary practice, just as practice gropes in the dark if its path is not illumined by revolutionary theory. But theory can become a tremendous force in the working class movement if it is built up in indissoluble connection with revolutionary practice, for theory and theory alone can give the movement confidence, the power of orientation, and an understanding of the inner relation of surrounding events, for it and it alone can help practice to realize not only how and in which direction classes are moving at the present time, but also how and in which direction they will move in the near future." End quote. Stalin. The unity of theory and practice is also supposed to exhibit a dialectical character, emphasis being laid in this connection on the, quote, decisive role of practical activity in this unity, the primacy, the preeminence of practice in relation to theory, end quote. This primacy is based on the fact that, quote, practice, the foundation for the development of theory, is also the criterion for theory's truth, and that the tasks created by theory can only find their solution in practice, end quote. M.N. Vrutkevich, in a book titled Practice as the Foundation of Knowledge and Criterion of Truth, 1932. In Lenin and Leninism, however, in contrast to Marx, a momentous shift of accent may be noted in the relation between theory and practice, namely that Lenin lays great stress on the necessity of, quote, bringing socialist consciousness into the proletarian movement from without. This contrast with Marx becomes all the more significant here, in that this, quote, from without, end quote, is actually taken by Lenin to mean that such a consciousness has arisen outside the working class, from within that bourgeois intelligentsia to which Marx and Engels belonged, i.e. the very class who, on Marx's theory of alienation, represent the main exponents of the inverted view of the world. Quote, "We have said," end quote, wrote Lenin, quote, "that there could not yet be social democratic consciousness among the workers, this consciousness could only be brought to them from without. The history of all countries shows that the working class, exclusively by the working class's own effort, is able to develop only trade union consciousness, i.e. it may itself realize the necessity for combining in unions, for fighting against the employers, and for striking to compel the government to pass necessary labor legislation, etc. The theory of socialism, however, grew out of the philosophic, historical, and economic theories that were elaborated by the educated representatives of the propertied classes, the intellectuals. According to their social status, the founders of modern scientific socialism, Marx and Engels, themselves belonged to the bourgeois intelligentsia. End quote. Lenin. What is to be done? It may be said indeed that even in Marx, consciousness enters into the movement of reality, quote, from without, end quote. But here it is the well-nigh spontaneous passage of a spark which kindles the fires of revolution, and thereby allows the truth, already latent as in a charmed sleep within reality, to emerge in full blaze and from the latter. But in Lenin, and still more in Stalin, there is need of a mighty organized effort in order to bring a socialist consciousness to the workers' movement, and it was precisely for this purpose that Lenin founded the Communist Party. The elaboration of a socialist ideology and the, quote, bringing of this into the workers' movement figures even to this day as one of its most important tasks. Quote, throughout its glorious history of more than half a century, the Communist Party of the Soviet Union has regarded it as of first-rate importance to develop the socialist ideology and to bring this into the workers' movement and into the consciousness of the working class, end quote. M.T. Iovchuk, in the book The Role of Socialist Ideology in the Struggle with the Survivals of Capitalism. Socialist consciousness here is not something which awakens almost of its own accord. It has to be laboriously brought to the workers first. The unity of theory and practice is therefore an artificial creation. Quote, the unification, bracket, even the terminology here is characteristic, not, quote, unity, end quote, merely, but, quote, unification, end quote, Gustav Vetter, end bracket, of socialist ideas with the workers' movement is brought about by the revolutionary party of the proletariat, end quote. Emen Rutkevich, excuse me. Now it is interesting to see how the party affects this unity of theory and practice. It becomes evident in the course of this how the differing conceptions of the translation of theory into the reality of the proletarian movement, as entertained by Marx on the one hand and by Lenin and Stalin on the other, contain the root from which the latter have evolved an image of the party which might well have filled Marx with dismay. As a postscript to Stalin's declaration about the, quote, tremendous organizing, mobilizing, and transforming value, end quote, of political ideas and theories, Rutkevich attempts the following description of the manner and method whereby the party introduces theory into the workers' movement. The first thing, having regard to theory and the party program, is to, quote, draw up a plan of action, a correct political line of behavior for each strategic phase, end quote, so as, quote, to know how to ensure that the political line shall take concrete shape in clear-cut slogans, rallying cries and directives, rules and regulations intelligible to the masses, end quote. Emen Rutkevich. Since, as Stalin says, quote, great energy is aroused only for a great objective, end quote, one must put this great objective before the masses as a completely concrete call to immediate action. It is in this way that the ideas of Marxist-Leninism acquire their gigantic mobilizing power. But the conceptual indoctrination of the masses is not sufficient by itself. Quote, the mobilizing power of progressive ideas must be supplemented by their organizing power. End quote. Rutkevich. In his report to the 17th Party Congress, Stalin very definitely underlined the necessity for organizational intervention if ideas were to be translated into reality. Quote, good resolutions and declarations in favor of the general line of the party are only a beginning. They merely express the desire for victory, but not the victory itself, after the correct political line has been laid down. Organizational work decides everything, including the fate of the political line itself, its success or failure, end quote. Here Stalin considers two factors in particular to be of crucial importance. The first, essential for a success in organization, is the correct choice of the most highly conscious elements and their continual supervision during the carrying out of directives. But this must be coupled with a flexible and sensitive attitude towards the claims of the masses, which implies that, quote, in issuing slogans, directives, and regulations, and in drawing up plans, the objective conditions of social development and the level of mass consciousness should be taken into account. End quote. Marx had supposed it enough to awaken the world from its dream of itself and to make it conscious of the thing dreamt of, in order for it already to possess this thing in reality. Stalin had doubtless learnt better than that from experience. It had taught him that the awakening of the proletariat is by no means so simple a matter as Marx would have it appear. It needs a well thought out, tightly knit organization which keeps even the better informed elements under continual pressure and control, and beguiles the less informed by an elastic deference to their more limited awareness. Thanks to the mobilizing and organizing power already described, the ideas of Marxist-Leninism also come to have a, quote, gigantic transforming power. A, quote, gigantic transforming power, end quote. With the liquidation of the exploiting classes in the Soviet Union, an ever-increasing importance has come to be attached to the subjective factor, i.e. to Marxist-Leninist theory, to party policy, and to the communist consciousness of the masses. Quote, the colossal economic achievements of the Soviet people during the post-war years would have been impossible without the everyday work on communist education of the masses, carried out by the Communist Party and the Soviet state. In its world historical significance, the latest victory of the Soviet people, the considerable overfulfillment of the post-war 5-year plan for reconstruction and development of the national economy, represents a material incarnation of the ideas of Marxist-Leninism, and a living testimony to the mighty role played by revolutionary theory. The nearer Soviet society approaches to communism, the greater becomes the role of communist consciousness among the masses, the role of the ideas of Marxist-Leninism, end quote. From this conception of the unity of theory and practice, it follows that each is dependent on the other, that practice cannot get on without theory, nor theory without practice. In the first place, the Communist Party has need of theory in its practice because of its, quote, organizing, mobilizing, and transforming role, end quote. Quote, Marxist-Leninist theory serves the party and the people as a trustworthy compass. Marxist-Leninist theory equips them with knowledge of the laws of socialist construction, with an understanding of the interconnection of events and phenomena. It enables them to discover the underlying processes in life. It points out the course of development, the shortest way of advance to the goal. It gives warning of danger, and by its aid, the intrigues of the enemies of socialism are detected, serious mistakes are opportunely averted, and the masses are inspired with faith in the victory of socialism, end quote. But in particular, the Communist Party also cherishes its theory as a means of, quote, scientifically foreseeing the broad outlines of future development and thus of being able to pursue a, quote, scientifically grounded policy. Quote, dialectical materialism is able to provide a theoretical generalization not only of past facts but also of the present, and even to foresee the future in a scientific manner, end quote. As Lenin, too, had already emphasized in 1902, quote, without a revolutionary theory, there can be no revolutionary movement, end quote. Lenin. But theory itself requires, in Soviet opinion, to be intimately connected with practice. The general laws of social development have admittedly been discovered by the classical authorities of Marxism, but society is continually developing, and it is the task of the communist theoretician to provide a theoretical generalization of the new experiences of the proletariat in its struggle for communism. Quote, what a multitude of new things are occurring in the life of socialist society! Exclamation point. What great deeds are being accomplished by our Soviet people! Exclamation point. ... New ties are coming into being, new forms of cooperation and mutual aid among men, of creative initiative on the part of workers, collective farm peasants, and the intelligentsia, new forms of growth of communist consciousness. All these processes are of world historical significance. Our country is pointing all other countries toward the new day. It is opening the road to communism for the whole of mankind, end quote. All these experiences, quote, therefore call for diligent study and theoretical generalization, end quote. All this betokens the creative character of Marxism, Hence, especially in recent years, there has been a determined campaign against, quote, dogmatism, quote, pedantry, nachetnichestvo, and, quote, Talmudism. Even today, the classic justification for this struggle is still derived from Stalin's letters on linguistics, quote, as a science, Marxism cannot stand still. It develops and is perfected, and In its development, Marxism cannot but be enriched by new experience, new knowledge. Consequently, some of its formulas and conclusions cannot but change in the course of time, cannot but be replaced by new formulas and conclusions corresponding to the new historical tasks. Marxism does not recognize invariable conclusions and formulas obligatory for all epochs and periods. Marxism is the enemy of all dogmatisms. End quote. Stalin. Only, quote, the dogmatists and Talmudists regard Marxism in separate conclusions and formulas of Marxism as a collection of dogmas which, quote, never change, notwithstanding changes in the conditions of the development of society, end quote. Stalin. Marxism and Problems of Linguistics. The charge of separating theory from practice is directed above all at the Social Democrats. The Social Democrats have turned Marxism into a rigid dogma and use Marxism to justify their political opportunism. Within Soviet philosophy, the same objection has also leveled especially against mechanism and, quote, Menshevizing idealism, end quote. The mechanist paid altogether too little regard to theory and thereby lapsed into a narrow-minded activism and myopic officiousness. The, quote, Menshevizing idealists, end quote, on the other hand, neglected practice. Their activity was stifled in abstract theorizing, from which all living class antagonism had been stained away. Till the present day, indeed, even since Stalin's death, and in spite of the de-Stalinization campaign, the Soviet ideologists are continually being accused of separating theory and practice, and of, quote, Talmudism, quote, pedantry, and dogmatism. Khrushchev set the tone in his report to the 20th Party Congress, when he declared the state of ideological work, quote, the main shortcoming at present is that it is largely divorced from the practice of communist construction, end quote, Khrushchev. And almost in Stalin's own words, Khrushchev continues, quote, Marxist-Leninism teaches us that a theory isolated from practice is dead, and practice which is not illumined by revolutionary theory is blind, end quote. And in order to avoid, quote, slipping into Talmudism and dogmatism, end quote, the theory of Marxist-Leninism must be translated into action by, quote, practical day-to-day effort to increase production and raise the well-being of the working people, end quote, Khrushchev. In the leading article of the second number of the 1956 volume, the editors of Vопроsi Philosophy point out the lessons to be learnt by the philosophers from these statements of Khrushchev's, with particular reference to the link between, quote, Talmudism and dogmatism, end quote, and the, quote, cult of personality, end quote. Quote, the personality cult and pedantry dogmatism always go hand in hand, end quote. And in this connection, they paint a very striking picture of ideological work in Stalin's day. Quote, instead of allowing themselves to be guided by Marxist-Leninism and its method, and generalizing independently upon the living experience and historical development of the present day, many workers in the social sciences thought it their main business to parrot quotations, to reiterate commonplaces enunciated by a person in authority, to enthuse over Talmudically interpreted utterances, end quote. The chief symptom of this personality cult was that, in flat defiance of the materialist conception of history, it forgot the Marxist axiom concerning the decisive role of the masses in history and imputed the main source of progress to the activity of a, quote, superhuman personality. A further consequence of the cult was to be seen in a limitation of philosophical inquiry to the particular group of problems dealt with in Stalin's essay titled Dialectical and Historical Materialism. Quote, the erroneous idea got about that this work, which gives a condensed account of the foundation of dialectical and historical materialism, was actually the, quote, summit of Marxist philosophy, end quote. Owing to this cult of personality, a series of dogmas arose in Marxist philosophy. Quote, dogmas which put thought in chains and hampered independent creative work in the field of dialectical and historical materialism, and also in the history of philosophy, end quote. Such a dogma, too, was the false idea that Stalin's, quote, principal features of the dialectical method and of philosophical materialism exhausted all the problems of dialectical materialism. Many logicians had, quote, concluded from this that there was no need to work out a dialectical logic, and that formal logic was the only logic, in complete contrast to Lenin, who had called for the creation of a, quote, greater, i.e., a dialectical logic. This same dogma was also responsible for the low estimation accorded to the categories of the materialist dialectic, since nothing was said about them in Stalin's essay. From all the foregoing discussion of the principle of the unity of theory and practice, it emerges that from the Soviet standpoint, it is absolutely impermissible to try to discern the essence of Marxism merely in a socio-economic doctrine or in some sort of positive science of the transformation of society, or to suppose that its socio-political program has no intrinsic connection with the world outlook of materialism. Just as dialectical and historical materialism form a monolithic structure, so theory and social political practice likewise constitute an indivisible unity. Quote, dialectical materialism is the theoretical foundation of the practical activity of our party. The party of Lenin and Stalin has solved and continues to solve all problems of its program, its strategy, and its tactics in complete accordance with the teaching of dialectical and historical materialism. The politics of our party are founded on the bedrock foundation of the dialectical materialist world outlook. End quote. Thus, although the idea may later have gained currency in certain communist circles outside Russia, that communism is not essentially a materialist doctrine, and even that it has nothing whatever to do with a world outlook, such opinions from the point of view of Soviet philosophy are either heresy or merely temporary concessions, deviations to be tolerated for the moment for the sake of some practical advantage, but liable when the time comes to be ruthlessly wiped out again. It would equally be a dangerous delusion to expect that, in pursuit of a policy of, quote, coexistence, Soviet communism may somehow liberalize itself to the extent of permanently tolerating another worldview in addition to its own within its sphere of control. To do such a thing would imply an abandonment of the principle of the unity of theory and practice, and hence of Marxism itself. In his report to the 20th Party Congress, Khrushchev expressly warns his hearers against transferring the slogan of coexistence into the ideological sphere, describing it as a, quote, harmful mistake, end quote, to attempt to carry the principle of coexistence out of the political sphere into that of ideology. Quote, it does not at all follow from the fact that we stand for peaceful coexistence and economic competition with capitalism that the struggle against bourgeois ideology, against the survivals of capitalism in the minds of men, can be relaxed. End quote. Your discussion of the unity of theory and practice shows yet another aspect of Soviet affairs in an entirely new light, namely the 5-year plans. The latter are more than merely attempts to rationalize the economy on a gigantic scale. They are regarded much more as that, quote, actualization of philosophy, end quote, that extension of philosophy into real life of which Marx himself spoke. This conviction that the idea must be realized in life, that truth must be conceived, not in a theoretical sense merely, but as a living aspect of practical endeavor, accounts for the pathos, the pseudo-religious ceremony with which labor is invested under the Bolshevik regime. Quote, the basic tenets of Marxist philosophy, made concrete in the politics of our party, have become guiding principles for the activities of tens of millions of Soviet citizens who are creating a new life, end quote. These principles have evoked a powerful response among the masses of the people, quote, who are purposefully rebuilding their way of life on the basis of knowledge of the laws of reality as disclosed by Marxist philosophy, ... end quote. With this motif of truth, as something to be realized, Marxism was bound, in Russia at least, to fall in fertile soil. For the notion of pravda as a truth to be realized and a true reality is none other than the age-old Russian ideal that has long since served as a beacon to the minds of the Russian people, inspiring both the researches of the thinker and the humble quest of the Tranik, the simple pilgrim among the people who traversed the endless Russian plains, making his way from one shrine to the next, eternally seeking a higher truth and a more perfect way of life. Section 4. The partisan character of philosophy. The demand for unity of theory and practice is intimately connected with the other requirement of the greatest significance in Soviet philosophy, the demand for partisanship in philosophy, for the exercise of party spirit in philosophical activity. The classical formulation of this, to which Soviet philosophers are constantly recurring, was given by Lenin in his polemic against Struve. Quote, Materialism includes, so to speak, partisanship in that it enjoins the direct and open adoption of the standpoint of a definite social group in any judgment of events. End quote. Peter Struve, as we have seen in Part 1, has contended in the course of his polemic against the early Russian Marxists that it would be nonsensical to talk of any kind of party philosophy. The Leninist demand for a party affiliation in philosophy stands in such direct contrast to the objectivity which we are accustomed to regard as the first prerequisite of scientific thought, that we are utterly at a loss to understand how it can have been put forward by a thinker in all earnest. But the matter becomes intelligible as soon as we take our stand upon the materialist conception of history. For within a class society on this view, every form of social consciousness, including philosophy in particular, appears as class-determined, as an expression of the interest of one or another class. Quote, a non-party neutral philosophy, indifferent to the interests of this or that class, does not exist and cannot do so long as there are classes and a class struggle, end quote. Party-mindedness is therefore a characteristic not of proletarian philosophy only, but also of the bourgeois variety. The difference lies only in this, that the former openly admits the fact, whereas the latter endeavors to conceal its partisanship under a mask of, quote, objectivity. Quote, in bourgeois society, absence of partisanship merely signifies a hypocritical, wrapped-up passive expression Where the hell am I? Quote, in bourgeois society, absence of partisanship merely signifies a hypocritical, wrapped-up, passive expression of membership of the party of the well-fed, the party in power, the exploiters' party, end quote. Lenin. This alleged hypocrisy of bourgeois philosophy explains why it can never be really objective, and why its subjectivism is bound to yield a distorted account of reality, since the practice of the bourgeoisie consists in exploitation. The function of its theory is to cover up this situation. There is also a further reason why bourgeois philosophy can never be really objective, for it seems that the bourgeoisie has an interest in representing reality in a distorted form. Quote, it is to their interest because the true interpretation of reality foreshadows the downfall of the bourgeoisie. Their efforts to perpetuate their dominant position arose in the bourgeoisie, a conflict between their own desires and reality, since the course of history is in process of putting an end to the dominating position of the bourgeoisie. Hence the bourgeois dread of looking into what is for them a bleak future. The bourgeois ideologists, to borrow a phrase from Marx, find enchantment in contemplating the past, uncertainty in face of the present, and dread at the thought of the future. End quote. M.A. Leonov. In complete contrast to bourgeois partisanship, it is held to be characteristic of proletarian partisanship that its subjectivism reflects reality not in a distorted form, but as it really is, and hence that its subjectivism is at the same time truly objective in character. How can this be so? Dialectical materialism attributes it to the fact that the subjective interests of the proletariat coincide with the objective laws of development. Quote, present-day social life develops by virtue of objective laws, independent of the human will, and develops in the direction of an inevitable collapse of the old capitalist society and the victory of the new communist society, ... The class interests of the working class not only do not conflict with the objective laws of social development, but completely coincide with them, ... Hence it must be the object of the working class and their ideologists to achieve an all-round grasp of the development of laws of nature and society, and to provide a correct, undistorted philosophical account of the world. The more completely the interests of the working class find expression in philosophy, the more exactly, completely, and profoundly will it render the objective laws of the world about us. End quote. This principle of partisanship is based on the notion that so far as knowledge of truth is concerned, the proletariat is in a privileged position. It appears to some extent to be the bearer of a new kind of quote, revelation, and hence granted, of course, the validity of the materialist conception of history. It will readily be seen that one has to adopt the standpoint of the proletariat in order to really know reality aright. But the demand for partisanship means more than this. In virtue of this principle, the philosopher is not merely bidden to adopt the standpoint of proletarian class interest. He must also be guided above all in his work by the Communist Party. The Communist Party, the quote, vanguard of the working class. Quote, a persistent struggle to carry through the policies of the Communist Party, a relentless warfare against all enemies of the proletarian world outlook. This is the most essential meaning of the Marxist-Leninist principle of party-mindedness in philosophy. End quote. In the concrete, this partisanship of philosophy must show itself in the philosopher's loyal adherence to the party line throughout this work. According to the political task to be accomplished by the party at any time, we therefore find endlessly renewed variations on the summons to partisanship. At the end of the 20s and beginning of the 30s, when the party was carrying on a campaign against right and left-wing deviations in the political field, it became a duty for the philosophers, in the name of the call to partisanship, to engage in a similar, quote, war on two fronts, and quote, against the theoretical foundations of these deviations, namely mechanism and Menshevizing idealism. In the years after the Second World War, roughly until the death of Stalin, and especially during the period of so-called Zhdanov's China, the quote, Zhdanov policy, which found its clearest epitome in the latter's speech in the course of the philosophical discussion of 1947, the main watchwords of partisanship were war on, quote, objectivism, war on, quote, cosmopolitanism, war on, quote, servility towards bourgeois culture, and, quote, and the display of a symbolic, quote, Soviet patriotism, end quote. The nature of objectivism may be gathered from the charge leveled by Zhdanov against Alexandrov. It is objectivism when Alexandrov, quote, before criticizing some bourgeois philosopher, pays, quote, tribute to his merits and burns incense to him, end quote. F. Chernov, in the piece, Bourgeois Cosmopolitanism and its Reactionary Role. The ideological approach extends to orthography. Thus, the Russian text of this above-mentioned article departs from orthodoxy in this respect by spelling the words, quote, homeland, Rodina, and, quote, fatherland, Otechество, with a capital. End footnote. Quote, Soviet patriotism has very frequently degenerated, however, into blatant Great Russian nationalism. The excuse for this was doubtless provided by Stalin's well-known toast to the virtues of the Great Russian people, delivered at the Kremlin after the victory over Hitler on the 24th of May, 1945. The many and often grotesque claims to cultural priority on behalf of the Russian people that have been advanced in connection with this are common knowledge, but it may not be so generally realized that an acknowledgement of Russian dominance was demanded as proof of a true, quote, proletarian outlook, not only among the other peoples of the Soviet Union, but also from the international workers' movement as a whole. Since the death of Stalin, the precept of partisanship has acquired a somewhat different concrete content. The necessity of the struggle against cosmopolitanism is still to be heard of, indeed, but in line with the new approach to, quote, bourgeois philosophy and science, which have already had occasion to notice. There are now warnings against a, quote, nihilistic attitude towards Western culture. Quote, The Leninist principle of partisanship in philosophy consists not only in uncompromising criticism of reactionary interpretations given by bourgeois intellectuals to the latest discoveries in science, but also in the demand that everything of real value produced by science in the modern capitalist countries shall be taken over and carefully preserved. End quote. There's a couple footnotes here that I missed. The first footnote pertaining to Hitler's speech on after the victory over Nazism. Footnote, quote, "Comrades, permit me to propose one more last toast. I should like to propose a toast to the health of our Soviet people, and in the first place the Russian people. I drink in the first place to the health of the Russian people, because it is the most outstanding nation of all the nations forming the Soviet Union, ... I propose a toast to the health of the Russian people, not only because it is the leading people, but also because it possesses a clear mind, a staunch character, and patience. ... It trusted the correctness of the policy of its government, and it made sacrifices to ensure the root of Germany. ... Thanks to it, the Russian people, for this confidence! ... To the health of the Russian people." End quote. Stalin, Moscow, 1947. Or I guess that's the book it's published in. And footnote. And the other footnote says, quote, "Love for the Russian people, which is marching together with the other peoples of the Soviet Union, the vanguard of the common proletarian struggle for communism, is not only one of the most important aspects of Soviet patriotism, it is a characteristic feature of every genuinely proletarian movement, even in capitalist countries." End quote. And that's from an article titled "For a Bolshevik Partisanship in Philosophy" from 1948. Anyway, and footnote. According to Yovchuk, the struggle against cosmopolitanism does not call for a purely negative attitude towards Western European philosophy and science. It presupposes rather, quote, "a deep respect for the cultural heritage, not only of one's own people, but also that of others." End quote. Yovchuk. The elasticity of the principle of partisanship is very clearly shown in a recent leading article in Vопроsi Philosophy, written after the events of October 1956 in Poland and Hungary had already taken place. The philosophers are again enjoined in the spirit of the 20th Congress to cast off the relics of, quote, "dogmatism and pedantry," end quote, so often induced by the Stalinist cult of personality, and exhorted to, quote, "independent study of life," end quote, albeit, quote, "under the leadership of the party," end quote. But immediately there comes a reminder of all those who had been only too literal in their acceptance of such exhortations, quote, "The Leninist principle of partisanship must be made the foundation of all our work in developing and propagating the communist world outlook," end quote. This is aimed in the first place at those who, with a view to the effective development of the materialist world outlook, also had demanded freedom on behalf of idealist philosophy. Secondly, at those who, quote, "have interpreted the task of developing Soviet democracy as laid down in the 20th Party Congress in a bourgeois anarchist sense as freedom from party leadership," end quote. And finally, at a certain current of opinion among the artists who were finding party leadership in the arts an oppressive affair, when B.A. Nazarov and O.V. Gridneva, for example, insist on the major role of popular opinion in artistic development, there is certainly something in what they say, but they tend to lose sight of the fact that the official viewpoint develops at all times under the influence of the various social ideas worked out by the ideologists of different classes. Quote, "Public opinion among the Soviet people is formed and developed under the leadership of its most progressive part, its avant-garde, the Communist Party, under the guiding, organizing, and inspiring influence of the great ideas of Marxism-Leninism." End quote. If, after all that we have just heard about the principle of partisanship, we now return to what was said earlier about the unity of theory and practice, we can see that the party has a dual role in bringing about this unity. In the first place, it figures as the organ which brings forth the idea, consciousness from out of reality. It is the party which, quote, generalizes the experiences of the working class and their struggle. One second. Where the hell am I? And thereby continuously promotes the development of Marxist-Leninist theory. Quote, the Communist Party and its Central Committee are not only the collective organizers, but also the collective center for the development of Marxist theoretical thought. End quote. Its strength is seen precisely in the fact that it not only conducts its practical activity in accordance with Marxist-Leninist theory, but also conversely, quote, boldly brings theory itself into line with the new data of historical development, end quote. The resolutions of party congresses and conferences, together with those of plenary sessions of the Central Committee, must therefore be regarded accordingly as, quote, classical examples, not merely of the application of Marxist-Leninist theory to life, but also of the creative advancement of Marxist-Leninist theory, end quote. The party is also supposed, on the other hand, to be the organ whereby socialist consciousness is again, quote, brought to the workers' movement. We have had evidence above of the amount of energy expended by the party in order to imbue the workers' movement with socialist consciousness. This Janus aspect of the party is governed by the dual character assigned by Stalinism to the ideological superstructure. On the one hand, the various social theories and political institutions emerge from the basis, but on the other, they are supposed, once they have arisen, to react vigorously upon it. Hence it is the party which causes the idea to arise out of reality, and is also the party which, once the idea has arisen out of reality, again applies it thereto, brings about its, quote, incarnation. And thus transfigures reality into the shape of the idea. Quote, the history of the CPSU represents an organic unification of revolutionary theory and revolutionary practice, the visible incarnation of Marxist-Leninism. The visible incarnation of the ideas of Marxist-Leninism, end quote. And that's from an article titled For a Creative Study of Marxist-Leninist Theory, published in Communist, 1954. Quote, the policy of the Communist Party and the Soviet government is Marxist-Leninism in action, quote. Hegel remarked on one occasion, quote, the march of God in the world, that is what the state is. Quote, the march of God in the world, that is what the state is. When one considers the all-commanding status of the Communist Party and how it underlies the principle of partisanship just described, one may feel inclined to rewrite Hegel's epigram and to say, quote, the march of God in the world, that is what the Communist Party is, end quote. Section 5, the philosophical, quote, atmosphere in the USSR. After all that has been said of, quote, partisanship in the previous section, we should now be in a position to understand the peculiar, quote, atmosphere in which philosophy is carried on in the USSR. The principle of, quote, partisanship means, as N. Berdyaev very rightly remarks, that Soviet philosophy is really no longer philosophy at all, since genuine philosophy presupposes freedom of thought. Quote, Soviet philosophy is, more a sort of godless, quote, theology, quote. It depends on revelation in the, quote, holy scriptures, end quote. It bows before the authority of a, quote, church and the opinions of the, quote, fathers. It distinguishes between, quote, orthodoxy and, quote, heresy, Philosophical discussions here imply no free pursuit of truth, no clash of diverse opinions matched in argument. It consists in the unmasking of heresies and the excommunication of those convicted of them. End quote. N. Berdyaev. And that quote's from 1934. The expression, quote, godless theology is a very apt description of the Soviet philosophy, for despite its repudiation of God and revelation, Soviet philosophy despite its repudiation of God and revelation, the Soviet method is philosophy and a typically theological one. Soviet method in philosophy is a typically theological one. The basic assumption of, quote, Soviet philosophizing, end quote, is precisely that found in theology, namely the existence and continuously felt presence of a, quote, infallible source of doctrine. I like this. So I'm going to copy it down. There's nothing you can do about it. It's like, I'm sorry, this is an interruption or a pause of the video. Where am I? Quote, the organizer and leader in the workers' struggle for communism, the organizer of all ideological and political activity in the Soviet state is the Bolshevik Party. The Central Committee of the Bolshevik Party represents not only the political but also the theoretical nerve center of the country, end quote. In contrast, however, to a truly theological method which remains strictly confined to the field of revelation, i.e. to matters of faith and morals, and is invoked in other fields of inquiry, such as philosophy, at most as a, quote, negative norm, the Bolshevik, quote, source of infallible doctrine, quote, extends, as we have already seen from the foregoing, and we shall see further in the chapter on, quote, Dialectical Materialism and Modern Science, end quote, into every field of knowledge and culture. This constant endeavor to demonstrate the conformity of party doctrine to the sciences, or rather of the sciences to party doctrine, often verges on the grotesque. When a certain comrade Zaitsev, for example, of the Moscow Engineering Institute, complains at the All-Union Conference of High School Professors of Marxist-Leninism that some of the students at his institute have not yet grasped, quote, that physics can be a partisan science, end quote. We feel ourselves back in the darkest days of Tsarist cultural politics under Nicholas I, in which, for fear of, quote, injurious influences, end quote, from Western European philosophy, an official, quote, curriculum of philosophy, end quote, was prescribed, whence it came about, for example, that a professor at the University of Kazan was led to expatiate at length on the, quote, complete conformity of mathematics with Christian doctrine, end quote. That's quotes from A. Vevedensky. The Vicissitudes of Philosophy in Russia, published in 1924. A further characteristic feature of Soviet philosophy, which it owes to the principle of, quote, partisanship, is its militancy of manner. Berdiaev very aptly describes the Soviet philosophers as, quote, warriors of philosophia militans, end quote. In reading the products of Soviet philosophy, it is perhaps this very militancy, the almost military character of their terminology, which chiefly strikes the eye. There is talk of, quote, philosophical front, of the training of, quote, philosophical cadres, whose task it is to carry on a war, a, quote, war on two fronts, end quote, and more especially of late, to deliver, quote, annihilating blows, end quote, in a, quote, relentless struggle, end quote, against bourgeois ideology. The first number of the Prosy Philosophie, after the reorganization of the editorial board, was reviewed by Pravda under the significant title, quote, for a militant philosophical journal, end quote. The reader will already have noticed how even today the Soviet philosophers very frequently preface the titles of their articles with the verbs, quote, for or, quote, against, and how the word, quote, struggle repeatedly crops up in these headings. In the philosophical discussion on Alexandrov's book, Zhdanov depicts in graphic phrases the conception of a, quote, philosophical front, quote, end quote. Quote, we have often used in our discussion the term, quote, philosophical front, but where is this front? The philosophical front does not exactly resemble our notion of a front. When we speak of the philosophical front, it immediately suggests an organized detachment of militant philosophers, perfectly equipped with Marxist theory, waging a determined defensive against hostile ideology abroad and against the survival of bourgeois ideology in the consciousness of Soviet people within our country. But does our philosophical front resemble a real front? It resembles rather a stagnant creek or a bivouac far from the battlefield. The field has not yet been entered. For the most part, contact with the enemy has not been established. There is no renaissance. The weapons are rusting. The soldiers are fighting at their own risk and peril, while the commanders either intoxicated with past victories or are debating whether they have sufficient forces for an offensive or should ask for aid from outside, or are discussing to what extent consciousness can lag behind daily life without appearing to lag too far. End quote. A final expression of the demand for partisanship in philosophy is to be found in the collective character of the Soviet philosophizing, and in the fact that it is thought possible to apply norms and planning to philosophical no less than to industrial production. Quote, their thinking, says Berdiaev, of the Soviet philosophers, quote, has become completely impersonal. Philosophical research is conducted by an anonymous collective, guided by the party line and governed by the ideological requirements of revolutionary economic construction. We cannot help being reminded of the words of Verchovensky in Dostoevsky's book, The Devils, quote, we shall stifle every genius in the cradle, end quote, end quote. And Berdiaev. Ample illustration of this collective character of philosophical activity has already been assembled in Part 1. We have seen how it is repeatedly insisted that party directives must be loyally adhered to in ideological work, how philosophical productions have to be submitted for collective discussion prior to publication, how whole, quote, collectives of philosophical workers engage in producing individual works, and so on. The thing that makes creative philosophical work especially difficult, however, is the planning and setting of norms for philosophical production. The plans are drawn up by the Presidium of the Academy in conjunction with representatives of the interested ministries and other institutions, particular attention being paid in every case to the directives handed down at the last party congress or the last plenary session of the Central Committee. In previous years, the individual institutes of the Academy of Sciences also worked out their own plans, but in 1952, quote, institute plans, end quote, were done away with. Responsibility for the Institute's fulfillment of the plans laid down by the Academy falls upon the Bureau of the section subordinated to the Institute in question. Thus, in the Philosophical Institute's report on its activities for 1953, the Bureau of the section for economic, philosophical, and juridical sciences complains that up to the present, the habit of duplicated planning still persists in the Institute, in that the directors have failed to enlist all its members into fulfillment of the official plans of the Academy. As a result, the work of a section of the membership has eluded the control of the Bureau. At a coordinating conference of the Philosophical Institute held in January 1955, A.M. Bugidinov was critical of the failing. Quote, that the thematic programs on dialectical materialism ... are often drawn up in accordance with the particular interest of this or that specialist, and do not take as their starting point the demands of Soviet science and the tasks of communist construction, end quote. This atmosphere of planning, supervision, and pressure from above, with its restrictions on any sort of free initiative, is sufficient to explain the evident barrenness of philosophical achievement, which emerges so plainly from the account given in Part 1, and the way in which even so elementary a matter as the compiling of a philosophical textbook can become an affair of state, and one which even now awaits a satisfactory solution. The situation betrays a disastrous misunderstanding of the nature of mental work, namely the belief that it can be subjected to norms in exactly the same way as material production. The account just given of the philosophical, quote, atmosphere in the Soviet Union certainly found its most clear-cut expression in the Stalinist era, especially during the period of the Zhdanov's China. Since Stalin's death, as we have had occasion to note in Part 1, there have admittedly been signs of a certain relaxation of party dictatorship in the theoretical sphere, but the decisive fact for us is that no fundamental change has occurred. So long as liberty of expression is ultimately restricted to opinions current within Marxist-Leninism, it is impossible to talk of a genuine freedom of thought. Nor is this picture of the way in which philosophy is actually... Excuse me. Excuse me. Nor is this picture of the way in which philosophy is actually carried on in the USSR included merely for purposes of illustration. A grasp of the facts is really essential in order to form an opinion on the Soviet conception of philosophy. Without such awareness of how this conception operates in practice, all that has been said about the reinstatement of philosophy in its old rights, the determination of its subject matter in relation to the special sciences, the gradual readmission of a range of philosophical principles discarded by the older type of Marxism, and above all the campaign for the unification of theory and practice, for the realization of philosophy in everyday life, all this might otherwise create a sort of optical illusion and give the impression that the Soviet Union had been the first to bestow upon the world the true conception of philosophy. In actual fact, the over-refined interpretation put by Lenin and Stalin on the Marxist notion of the unity of theory and practice has led directly to a new and exceedingly unhealthy separation of the two fields. Philosophy ceases in consequence to be thought of as an unprejudiced pursuit of truth, no longer bound in the first instance to the, quote, service of truth, end quote. It is subordinated instead to practical interest and ultimately to politics. Its first duty is no longer to find out what is true. It is obliged to proceed rather from certain propositions deemed, quote, incontestable, end quote, in virtue of having been laid down by the, quote, classical authorities, end quote, and to, quote, instill them into the consciousness of the masses, end quote, in order to lend, quote, security and a, quote, sense of direction to the revolutionary movement. This indifference to the truth has led Soviet theory into a new and marked separation of theory from practice. It has become, in effect, a sort of arsenal of euphemistic slogans, serving to cloak realities of a very different and often decidedly brutal sort. There was talk, for instance, of a, quote, colossal mass movement among the people who are purposefully rebuilding their way of life on the basis of knowledge of the laws of reality, end quote. Whereas in actual fact, the conjuring up of this, quote, movement has required the incarnation of forced labor camps of approximately 1/7 of the adult male population. The, quote, friendship of the peoples of the Soviet Union, end quote, is described as a spur to the development of the new Soviet society, whereas it is to be feared that certain smaller nations under the Soviet hegemony are actually in the process of extermination, as witness, for instance, the mass deportations from the Baltic territories and from Hungary after the crushing of the revolution of October 1956. The Soviet action in Hungary was indeed twice branded by the General Assembly of the United Nations on the 9th and 22nd of November 1956 as a breach of its convention, to which the Soviet Union was also a signatory, quote, for the prevention and punishment of the crime of genocide, end quote. There is talk of, quote, criticism and self-criticism, end quote, though in fact, as we have seen so clearly in Part 1, this invariably means criticism from above. The complete practical ineffectiveness and purely decorative character of this, quote, genuine Bolshevik criticism and self-criticism, end quote, is plain enough from the mere fact that, as has already been shown in detail, quote, criticism from above, end quote, has repeatedly felt itself obliged to reprove the very lack of such, quote, criticism and self-criticism, end quote. Measured against reality, all the theories erected on catchwords of this sort, such as those of, quote, friendship among the peoples of the Soviet Union, quote, Soviet patriotism, quote, criticism and self-criticism, end quote, etc., emerge as a system of empty concepts leading a life of their own, completely divorced from the real situation, over which they are required to throw a veil of extenuation and euphemism. And that is the end of the first chapter of Part 2 of Gustav A. Vetter's Dialectical Materialism, a Historical and Systematic Survey. Thank you so much for listening.